This is not a Lost Cause film. Here you won't be hearing stories of 10,000 black rebel soldiers attacking Yankees outside of Richmond. Neither will you hear any denials that many free and enslaved black men directly participated in the war on behalf of the rebel cause. Some of them had a choice, but most of them didn't. Just as the title says, this is the hard evidence for black Confederates, and everybody is about to get uncomfortable. So right off the bat, let's define the key term Black Confederate so we can be on the same page with what we're talking about. By the lay term black, we mean someone of African ancestry. In this case, African Americans in the Southeast during a specific time. But as you'll see, the term can and often does include mixed race individuals with two or more ethnic backgrounds from different continents, usually African and European. When we say Confederate, we mean a citizen or national of the Confederate States of America, a rebellion that created an experimental country in the southeastern United States that lasted 4 years and 2 months. So what's the difference between citizens and nationals? Citizens have the right to vote, hold public office, and participate in public institutions. All citizens are nationals, but not all nationals are citizens. The Confederate Constitution was vague on who could be a citizen, but Article 1, Section 2 specifically excludes from voting all people of foreign birth who aren't naturalized citizens of the Confederate States. The Dred Scott decision in the U.S. Supreme Court just 4 years earlier took citizenship away from all African Americans, and the CSA grandfathered in this legal doctrine. The term Confederate nationals refers both to citizens of the CSA and non-citizens who lived in the CSA, like free men of color, slaves, and Native Americans. Most black Southerners were Confederate nationals, but not citizens. They were allowed to live there because society needed their labor, and needed them to occupy certain rungs on the social ladder so that other Southerners could be higher on that ladder than them. When a lot of other people say black Confederates, they're talking about black Confederate soldiers. They're talking about guys in gray or butternut uniform, with rank, and with guns, fighting battles against the Bluecoats. That's the mental image that makes Lost Causers' mouths water, and which really intrigues people who are seeing or reading the term Black Confederates for the first time. In this film, the term Black Confederate simply means someone of African ancestry who was a Confederate national and who participated in the war on the rebel side in any meaningful capacity, including a small minority who were soldiers. That term would obviously exclude more than 180,000 Southern black men, most of whom were escaped slaves, who served in the Union Army, since they obviously rejected the Confederacy and fought to destroy it. When talking about black Confederate military personnel in this film, I'll make it clear by saying black soldiers, black sailors, or black militiamen. Let's just get this out of the way right now. Most black Confederates were not soldiers, although there were a lot of black Confederate nationals who saw a lot of combat in the capacity in which they worked. There are actually 6 different types of contributions that Southern black folks made directly to the war machine, not counting tending crops or working in the factories. There were black soldiers and naval sailors, which is numerically the smallest category. There were a lot more black militiamen than there were soldiers, and that figure is somewhere in the thousands. Then there were even more black Southerners in civilian labor battalions, or who worked as bodyguards, or as civilian contractors, and others who were Army civilians. Civilian contractors and Army civilians are not the same thing. The Confederate war effort heavily depended on each of these 6 categories at various points in time throughout the war. It also depended heavily on black slave labor in the fields to feed the rebel troops, and black labor in the factories to make weapons, ammo, clothes, and supplies. But nobody's arguing over the folks working in the fields or the factories. They're arguing over the extent to which black Southern men were combatants for the rebellion. When lay historians point to black Confederates, the examples they provide, once under closer scrutiny, usually fall into one of the other 5 categories besides soldier, despite a lot of laymen trying to pass these guys off as soldiers. While there certainly are many similarities between the black soldiers, militiamen, labor battalions, body servants, civilian contractors, and army civilians participating in the rebellion, these 6 categories were not the same thing. That said, there is no doubt that without the massive region-wide powerhouse of African American labor, both in and out of combat zones, the Confederate war effort would not have been possible. End of story. This is the hard evidence for Black Confederates. While it certainly helps to appreciate the complexity of the African American experience in the antebellum and wartime South, it does not make the Confederacy look good. We'll look at the black Southerners in the Confederate Army and some of the black sailors in the Confederate Navy in just a moment. First, it's important to get one thing straight so that no one walks away from this with the wrong idea. African American labor is a central and repetitive theme in the Civil War, especially when dealing with Southern society or the Confederate Armed Forces. It was so important to this experimental country that it was codified into the law of the land, more explicitly than in the United States Constitution that the rebel leaders rejected as not good enough. Article 1, Section 9 of the Confederate Constitution deals directly with slavery. Subsection 1 forbade the importation of new slaves from Africa, but we know from the Constitutional Convention and from the work of economic historians on that time period that this measure was to protect the high value of increasingly scarce and in-demand slaves, which only appreciated with time and scarcity. The real telling part is subsection 4, which says that no law denying or impairing the right of property in Negro slaves shall be passed. Article 4, Section 1 repeats that the property rights of slave owners will not be impaired. Section 2 makes it illegal for slaves to run away, while Section 3 holds that slavery will be protected in all states and territories belonging to the Confederate States. The Confederate Constitution literally mentions slavery more times than it mentions taxes, more times than it mentions the Army, Navy, and militia, and more times than it mentions any other kind of private property. They made slavery illegal to abolish and restated it multiple ways from multiple different legal angles. This is the Constitution to which Robert E. Lee, Stonewall Jackson, and every Confederate soldier, sailor, Marine, and public official, from Jeff Davis down to the local dog catcher, pledged to protect and defend when they entered Confederate service. The institution of slavery was so important to the Confederates that they wrote it down in their Magna Carta and in other documents multiple times for posterity, and made copies back when they thought they would win the war. After the Constitution of the Confederate States of America, we can look at the various declarations of secession from the rebel states and territories for the reasons why they left the Union. The first state to secede was South Carolina in December 1860. That secession declaration immediately complains that the 14 northern states have consistently failed to uphold their constitutional obligation to protect the property of citizens of the southern slaveholding states. Decoding this and re-saying it in plain English, the northern states were exercising their states' rights to not recognize the fugitive slave laws or anyone's claim to human property, and this was oppressive to the southern states. The South Carolina Declaration also mentions slavery, labor, and service, as in servants, some 27 times, with the further 2 mentions of hostile forces inciting servile insurrection, meaning slave rebellions. The only mention of taxes in their ordinance is in relation to the 3/5 clause of counting slaves as population for congressional districts based on taxes paid by their owners. Let's look further at the Confederate states that actually allowed black men in the military or the militia at one time or another during the war. The Louisiana State Militia had the first regiment of black troops in the war, period. Louisiana's secession ordinance was very short and did not mention slavery. However, slavery was a central topic of discussion in the Secession Convention, and the state even sent commissioners to Texas to convince Texas legislators to secede to protect Southern institutions. When they mean Southern institutions, they're not talking about peach cobbler and sweet tea. The state of Alabama allowed mixed-race Creels in the state militia. Right at the beginning of their secession ordinance, Alabama declared it was leaving the Union because Abraham Lincoln was elected and his party was hostile to slavery. Alabama then declared its intention to unify with the slaveholding states of the South. Now, in 1861, Lincoln was perfectly willing to leave slavery alone where it existed, including all of Alabama. This means the Alabama secession delegates saw the Republicans as hostile to slavery's extended presence outside the South. That being returning escaped slaves in the North to the South and allowing slavery in new territories out west. There is no mention in Alabama secession ordinance of taxes or tariffs. Quite a few black Georgians served in the Navy as junior enlisted sailors or were hired out to the Navy as civilian pilots. Georgia's secession document mentions slavery, labor, and servants a whopping 38 times. Plus, they threw the servile insurrection paranoia in the declaration as well. There are 0 mentions of taxes or tariffs. Next, Virginia allowed black Southerners to serve in all-black units with white officers at the very end of the war. There's no mention of slavery in Virginia's secession ordinance as it's a very short legal document. However, it was definitely a central topic discussed in the Secession Convention. This is where Alexander Stephens said to the convention in his famous cornerstone speech, "The great truth, I repeat, upon which our system rests, is the inferiority of the African," and he followed that up with, "Subordination to the white man is his normal condition." Well, that's Virginia. Since this documentary series is about the Civil War in the Wild West, let's look at the reasons for rebel confederation in the Far West. In the Lone Star State and former Republic of Texas, in their secession ordinance, slavery is mentioned over 20 times, while taxes and tariffs are not mentioned at all. The delegates also declared Texas was joining the Confederacy for the express purpose of maintaining and protecting the institution known as Negro slavery, the servitude of the African to the white race within her limits, a relation that had existed from the first settlement of her wilderness by the white race, and which her people intended should exist in all future time. And all future time means forever, folks. Next, we have the Arizona Territory, which seceded under the provisional government after the original 7 states seceded, but before Virginia and the other border states joined the rebellion. The Arizona Secession Ordinance declares first a declaration that the Republican Party has violated the rights of the southern states. They actually put that in before declaring their own legitimate grievance that the US government failed to protect them from Native American attacks, although in the document they used the term "savages in our midst." Then near the end of the document, the Arizona delegates declare, "We will not recognize the present black Republican administration." Black men were not voting Republicans in 1860 because they weren't US citizens, they weren't voting. When people in the 1850s and 60s said black Republicans, it was a slur for people who supposedly represented black folks but not Americans, meaning white-skinned Anglo-Americans. Not only did the Confederate government and its several states intend to preserve the institution of African slavery and subordination to white Americans, but they also aimed to expand the practice to new territories. With the exception of the relative few, very few African Americans who themselves became slave owners, the perpetuity and expansion of black slavery cannot be a cause that black Americans believed in, even if they felt deeply Southern and attached to their local community. It's important for me to say this and back it up with some of the most important primary sources of the Southern Rebellion, because of the widespread disinformation and lost cause mythology that continues poisoning the well of public opinion. Even as recent as a week before I made this film, content creators are uploading pseudo-documentaries to YouTube and talking nonsense about the common patriotism of Southern black men to the Confederate cause, and of the mythical tens of thousands, maybe even 100,000 black Southerners who fought as Confederate soldiers. There is indeed ample evidence of many thousands of Southern black men in some type of uniform and serving or working in a combat zone, but again, most of them were not soldiers. They made their claim to a big piece of Civil War history, but they were also severely discriminated against, and their discrimination was a feature of the Confederate experiment, not a bug. To better understand the odd paradox of black Confederates, we need to be able to tell the difference between black soldiers, black militia, and black civilian personnel attached to the Army in various capacities. Let's start with the black soldiers. With the few fascinating and remarkable exceptions we'll look at in just a moment, the only Confederate Army soldiers who were able to serve openly as black men were the black battalions recruited at the bitter end of the war. This was in March of 1865, when the law allowing black soldiers in the Army barely passed through Congress. A company's worth of African American Southerners from Richmond, mostly slaves, were recruited from among hospital workers into the Confederate States Negro troops. This unit was designated the 1st Battalion of Negro troops and was commanded by a white officer. This was the founding cadre, and the plan was to grow the unit to battalion strength, but it was only ever company strength with between 100 and 200 soldiers. To their credit, they were ideal recruits, since many were hospital workers and many had already seen battle as civilian ambulance drivers and hospital orderlies, evacuating wounded rebels from the battlefield, so they were no strangers to war. They also reportedly looked impressive when drilling outside in the public squares of Richmond. However, their barracks was a prison, and they were locked inside when not on duty, reflecting white society's lingering paranoia about slave insurrections. Oddly enough, these guys did spend a few days on the front line, but they didn't do much since most weren't armed. Ironically, they saw more combat as civilian laborers than they did as Confederate soldiers. Next, we have what the War Department hoped would be the 2nd Battalion of Negro troops, and this unit was below company strength. This founding company, if you could call it a company, was commanded by Anglo-American Major Thomas P. Turner, and had a whopping 35 volunteers as of March 27th, just 2 weeks before Lee surrendered at Appomattox Courthouse. By volunteers, in many cases I mean slaves voluntold by their owners, some of whom believed fanatically in the Confederate cause and were willing to sacrifice some slaves either to death on the battlefield or freedom through military service in order to save the rebellion and keep the rest of their slaves forever. In other cases, there were slaves and freemen who wanted to use this as an opportunity for advancement, and as far as the slaves, their owners allowed them to go, with the owners collecting their pay. That said, Robert E. Lee complained in his letters in March of 1865 about so many slave owners in Northern Virginia being unwilling to lend their slaves to the Army to save their country. As far as the black Confederate soldiers of March 1865, their total military service for the CSA lasted just under a month. I still haven't encountered any evidence that they served long enough to ever get paid, not that their pay would have been worth much in 1865, but in either case, their owners would have collected their pay. Surely some of these volunteers did feel an affinity and strong emotional bond for their owners and for their local communities. Stockholm Syndrome and, in many cases, mixed-race family relations were a weird thing that often accompanied master-slave relationships. That said, one group existed for the benefit of the other, and not the other way around, and that one group did not have the freedom to leave this arrangement. There's plenty of evidence of the weird Stockholm Syndrome type relationship between body servants and their owners, but we know little about the enslaved soldiers who served in 1865. We can ascertain that many, if not most of the volunteers saw the writing on the wall just as well as the white soldiers who were deserting en masse since 1864. That the war was already lost, and that these black volunteers were fighting specifically to earn their freedom through military service, which they would have gotten either by completing their contracts with the rebel army or by being captured by the Union. This makes me respect those individual slaves for their willingness to go to war and risk their lives in battle to earn their sacred freedom. I don't mean freedom as in Confederate independence or Southern nationalism, but as in real, individual self-ownership and agency. That said, none of these inspiring acts by incredible black Americans in the South changed the fact that the Confederate States Army existed to protect and uphold the government created to preserve slavery and expand it to new territories. Let's look at one such soldier who was not from one of the black battalions recruited in March of 1865, because this example points us to a trend among a small minority of troops in the Army. John William Buckner was a free man of color who served in the 1st South Carolina Artillery. His grandfather, William Ellison, was an ex-slave who became a slave owner himself, and was described at age 29 as having a yellow complexion. That would indicate that he was mixed race, probably half Caucasian or Anglo or more, to give him a complexion with less melanin in his skin than his African ancestors. Buckner was the son of 2 light-skinned mixed-race slave owners, so he most likely had more European ancestry than he had African ancestry, and he was able to pass for white. He was one of probably thousands of mixed-race Southerners serving in the Confederate Army. I don't doubt the number of free men of color enlisted as soldiers throughout the war really was in the thousands, but most or all of these guys were passing for white. Roughly 1 million Southern men served in the Confederate Army, so the presence of thousands of free men of color passing for white does nothing to change the fact that the Confederate Army was the army of the Republic that existed specifically to preserve black slavery and expand it to new territories. How do we know the free men of color serving as soldiers before 1865 were passing for white? We know because Article 46, Section 1399 of the Confederate Army Regulations, which anyone can go read online right now, unmistakably required soldiers to be white, while non-white personnel were only allowed to be musicians, cooks, or civilian contractors in other regulations. In some cases, like John William Buckner's, where mixed-race soldiers passed for white, other people knew about it but kept their mouths shut out of respect for a well-established member of the planter class. But there are also cases where people were outed as mixed race and promptly discharged from the army for being, quote, Negroes, unquote. One such soldier was Private Lefroy Pierre Auguste, a mixed-race Louisiana Creole passing for white in the 16th Louisiana Infantry Regiment. This regiment was made predominantly of ethnic Cajuns, which are white North American Frenchmen from the Gulf Coast, when American Southern society would have considered Pierre Auguste a Creole, which is a black North American Frenchman. He fought in the battles of Shiloh and Perryville, and he had a year's worth of picket duty, long marches, and fending off disease. Now, the details of the circumstances are unknown to me. I just know through my research that Pierre Auguste was outed to an officer as being mixed race, which under Article 46, Section 1399 of Army Regulations made him ineligible for military service. He was discharged in December 1862. I don't doubt he considered himself a Confederate patriot, and I don't blame him for embracing his European heritage while hiding his African heritage in a white supremacist country. He was not the only mixed-race soldier passing for white to be discharged for their ancestry when it was discovered. Therefore, when people point to different enlistment forms or veteran service records that openly declare the individual to be a free man of color, it's safe to assume they were musicians or cooks. They were important to the Army, but regulations and the law excluded them from enjoying the same legal status of soldiers as the white Southerners. The point is, regardless of their patriotism or how well they got along with white officers and community leaders, that country and that army that Lefroy Pierre Auguste and other men of color tried so hard to serve well specifically rejected them over a fraction of their DNA, while still exploiting their labor and putting them in harm's way in combat zones. It's just not right that lost causers today should claim soldiers like him to show what a diverse and egalitarian institution the Confederate Army was. Let's look at another branch of military service. Although we can lump them in the same category as soldiers, since they were counted as military personnel, there were also black Southerners who served in the Confederate Navy. Unlike the Army, which until March 1865 explicitly required soldiers to be white, the CS Navy regulations, specifically Chapter 30, Article 4, allowed free men of color to join the Navy. But there was a catch. These free men of color could join only with permission of the Naval Station Commander or by order of the department. To make that clear, the regulation did not say free men of color can simply join the Navy. It said they will only be accepted under limited circumstances. Slaves could, however, be enlisted as landsmen, which are people from the land who know little about sailing, and is a rank even lower than seamen. Randall Polk, a slave belonging to a naval surgeon, was enlisted by his owner as a landsman and served on the CSS Georgia in the Savannah Squadron. One slave who had reached the peak that was possible for enslaved African Americans to reach in the Southern social ladder was Robert Cole, one of President Jefferson Davis's slaves, and he was assigned to the CSS Patrick Henry in the James River Squadron. Dr. Edward Smith, former Dean of African American Studies at American University, Estimated as many as 1,150 men of color out of 6,000 total sailors in the Confederate Navy. One child of color who managed to enlist was Benjamin Gray, who joined the Navy at age 12 as a boy seaman and served in the Wilmington Squadron. The rank of boy in the Navy was like a cadet rank for minors who would become enlisted seamen once they were adults, whereas cadets were minors who would be officers at adult age. Boys in the Navy often worked as personal assistants for officers and warrant officers, kind of like child body servants, while also doing a lot of menial labor around the ship. Because they were minors, boy seamen were usually not subject to discipline under military law until they were 18. One of the most famous black sailors attached to the Confederate Navy in modern historiography is Moses Dallas. He was a slave, a highly skilled boat pilot, river and coastal, and he was hired directly by Flag Officer Josiah Tatnall at the rate of $60 a month. He was lucky, and a rare exception in that his owner let him keep his own salary. Slavery was a money-making institution for slave owners after all, so most slaves enlisted in or hired out to the Navy surrendered their pay to their owners, and if they were lucky, they were given some spending money. By early 1864, Dallas had made enough money to buy his wife and daughter's freedom. That right there is a big fat clue as to Dallas's motivation to put himself in harm's way, driving ironclads in a combat zone. Moses Dallas became a legend in the Confederate pantheon when he was killed in battle in Ossabaw Sound in June 1864, a martyr for the Southern nation. Lost causers and sloppy researchers like to claim Moses Dallas was an officer, which unfortunately is not true. He was a brave man for putting himself in harm's way as much as he did. He was listened to for his extensive vocational and technical expertise, and he was highly regarded by the white naval sailors he served with, despite being a slave. Yet, Moses was still discriminated against by the system, which sought to keep skilled workers like him enslaved in perpetuity. Unlike enlisting freemen of color, which required permission from Naval Station Level Command and usually a direct intervention from the Holy Spirit, slaves could enlist in the Confederate Navy or be enlisted with their owner's consent. Slaves could enlist as boys or landsmen, but not as pilots. However, enslaved pilots could be hired out to the Navy as contractors. For example, Moses Dallas the pilot worked in the Savannah Squadron on the Georgia coast, and this unit was raised for the Navy by the state, just like most Army regiments were raised by their home states. Freemen of color were forbidden from being boat pilots under Georgia law, but slaves could still be used as pilots, and they often were, and their owners were well compensated with salaries comparable to junior naval officers for their slave-skilled labor. Moses Dallas was not an officer in the Confederate Navy. He was an enslaved contractor with highly sought-after skills that were critical to naval operations. That is how he was able to buy his wife and daughter out of slavery. All of this makes him look like a champion underdog, while it makes the Confederacy as a whole look pretty terrible. Next, we have a fascinating example in Robert Small. I'm not sure whether Robert Small was a naval sailor or a contractor, but he was an enslaved man working on ships in Charleston Harbor, and he led several other enslaved crew members in a daring escape plot. On May 13, 1862, Smalls and several other slave sailors loaded their families on board the CSS Planter, hijacked the steamer, and they sailed it straight toward the Union blockade force, where they handed over the ship and its cargo of ammunition. For the Confederate war effort, boat slaves escaping was a constant concern and drain on manpower, just like escapes by the camp slaves were for the land forces. Overall, when it comes to black Confederate sailors, I'm disappointed that we know a lot more about the enslaved black civilian sailors attached to the Navy as pilots than we know about the men of color who were actually enlisted in the Navy. For historical accuracy, it's also important to distinguish between slaves who were enlisted in the Navy and other slaves who were hired out to the Navy for temporary labor. There's plenty of evidence to show that the Navy hired enslaved people to do temporary work on vessels and in Navy yards, like this receipt for 3 slaves who worked for the Navy for 22.5 days. According to Barbara Brooks Tomlin in her book Life in Jefferson Davis's Navy, 40% of the pilots in the Savannah Squadron were enslaved black contractors hired out to the Navy. That is absolutely incredible, astounding, and born of such a warped social ladder that the nakedness of the double standards boggles the mind. Free black men who were not going to run anywhere were forbidden from being pilots, yet 40% of the Savannah Squadron was enslaved pilots. That seems absolutely unreal, but it was real. This concludes part 1 of this documentary. In part 2, we'll explore black Southerners serving the Confederate war effort in state militia units, and the ones working as body servants in army camps and in combat zones. Thank you for watching the Civil War, Wild West Edition.